Hello and welcome to Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. This is our fourth Star Wars retrospective. Once again, I'm Gianni.
I'm Flynn.
I'm Sam.
And let's get right into it. Episode 4 came out on May 25th, 1977. And this was a hit, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And this was
Surprise
the
hit.
big new thing. I mean, George Lucas came out of the gate. This is probably his crown jewel, right? This is the best work he did as director and writer of a Star Wars film, I would say.
Of Star Wars
Yeah.
film. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah, and this is a movie that probably shouldn't exist and probably shouldn't have happened. And on set there was mess up after mess up, and at any given point during the filming of this movie, it could have just been scrapped.
Yep.
But they kept going, and the world's better for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was like mutiny among the crew.
Yeah. It was a Star Wars Episode 4 filming was a mess. They filmed the Tatooine bits in Tunisia, and it was a terrible environment to film in, especially when you consider like most of this movie is practical. So the C-3PO suit is real, the R2 suit is real. So you have these actors in this really restrictive like armor as they're trying to traverse a desert.
Yeah.
It didn't make for a good time.
Yeah, how about some of the sets you mentioned, like practical, everything is right there and it's real. And I think that's probably why it holds up today still. So much of it does. Granted, there have been, how many re-releases of this
Oh
film?
my god.
Too many.
At least 4?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's right. I think 4.
But nonetheless, it really does hold up. I think, and it's that classic hero tale, right? Luke Skywalker is the hero of this film. He's our protagonist. And then we have some really great supporting characters as well. I know that we wanted to get into, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I actually for a very long time didn't care for Star Wars because what I knew about it as a kid was what I learned from my older sisters, which were the archetypes, the hero, the bad boy with a good heart, the damsel. So I was really not interested in it, but you really see subversion in a good way in A New Hope, especially with, I think, in my opinion, Han's character, which I would love to talk about Han. I think the introduction of Han in this is really interesting because you watch his arc throughout the movie where he just starts to care more and more about Luke Skywalker and saving him to the point where at the end he legit's like, please run away with me so you don't die in this fight.
Yeah.
And I think that's not something that gets talked about a lot.
Yeah.
You talk about the Han and Leia and you talk about the Luke and Leia because they're the twins, but the Luke and Han relationship is really what holds this film together
Yeah.
a lot of the time. Yeah.
Yeah, and I brought up on the Revenge of the Sith retrospective, Star Wars at its heart being about love, and I think that that's something that really shines through in Luke and Han's relationship. Han has no reason to double back and join this fight. He doesn't feel like he has a stake in the fight. He doesn't feel like that's his place. He should be, he should be more than content operating exactly how he operated. But because of this kinship he has with Luke, he risks his own life to try and save this kid.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that is that Han kind of learns from Luke in a way. He sees that optimism of a young kid, and he's like, you know what? I can get behind that. And I think that's really the beautiful thing about their relationship. And how about Han and Chewie too?
Yeah. It's really interesting the like how people remember Han as this like badass kind of like gunslinger, and in reality he is like formulated as a person through his relationships with other people and creatures, and it's something that I don't think people talk about Han that way really a lot, and it's
Yeah, I think that people like to take the easy route and distill, like you were saying, into archetypes, and so he's the rogue with a good heart, but that's I think that probably the best way of looking at it is that, and this is all opinion based, but people tend to focus on the wrong things when it comes to Han. They tend to not enjoy the wrong things, but think certain things are important, when I think that other aspects of his character are far more important in both how he's represented and in Star Wars as a whole, as a complete story.
Yeah, I think similar to how Luke is in this world of the Force and the Resistance and this, that, and the other. I think Han is also kind of a fish out of water, especially in this adventure with Obi-Wan Kenobi. Which, let's talk about Ben Kenobi. I mean,
Yeah.
Alec Guinness.
Oh my God.
What a performance!
Yeah, the casting of Alec Guinness is really interesting because it's pretty well known that George Lucas wanted unknowns for the actors. So Alec Guinness was kind of the guy that gave credibility to the cast, so to speak. Yeah, but he was not a Star Wars fan. So, but nevertheless, like that doesn't hinder his performance at all. You buy into everything he's doing, and that's just, credit to how good he was at his craft. And he does add a certain element of legitimacy and mysticism to this world as soon as he's introduced. So I do think that bringing on Alec Guinness was the right idea for this cast, even though the fact that they're unknowns at the time really doesn't matter because this film is perfectly cast.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And just to keep talking about Alec Guinness for a second, I think what's really important to remember when you rewatch this movie is that Lucas had none of this planned. So like the Darth Vader reveals, Luke and Leia, Han and Leia. So just the ambiguity that Alec Guinness plays the Obi-Wan and Darth Vader scenes, how open he lets that relationship lie, so you can essentially, once Empire comes in, you can like retroactively be like, oh, it all makes sense. Like this all makes sense of why they have this, besides like what we knew about Darth and only Master of Evil Darth.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to be able to go back and when you revisit this movie, sort of like fill in the blanks with everything you now know about Obi-Wan and Anakin. If we're doing this as a progression of and like chronologically looking at it as a story, people have made edits of Alec Guinness's dialogue intercut with prequel footage, and it works so well. And a lot of that is credit to his performance. And in the sort of layers that you can read in that. But the big three are the cast members that I want to talk about because it is just absurd how well they nailed it. How good Mark Hamill is the wide-eyed farm boy biting off way more than he can chew. Carrie Fisher, who, as people have talked about, is sort of Hollywood royalty. At the time of this movie, and she just adds a certain like air of elegance to Leia, where you just immediately buy in that she's this princess, but at the same time like can handle herself way better than Luke and Han can.
Yes.
I mean, she is by far the most confident person in most scenes Leia is in. And Harrison Ford, who was not supposed to be Han. Harrison Ford was brought in during the audition process to read the character of Han because George was like, okay, this is the one guy I'm not going to use because Harrison Ford is in American Graffiti, which George Lucas directed, and George was going for all unknowns. So he brought in Harrison Ford, and then you watch Harrison Ford do test lines of Han Solo, and you know immediately that you can't bring in anybody else.
And I think it was actually, because you can find it out there from like the 70s talk shows, it was specifically the scenes he did with Mark Hamill that like got him, that Lucas was like, okay,
Yeah.
this is,
just absolutely perfect in every way. So
Yeah, I think, and their banter is also, I think, what solidifies that relationship, that trio. It's so believable, and their performances are just, their chemistry together is insane. And you talk about unknowns, and especially Mark Hamill coming in and being, as you mentioned, he's the wide-eyed farm boy, and he plays that so well. But he must have also been so new to acting and new to film in general. So it's just really amazing that it worked as well as it did.
Yeah.
And I feel like we were kind of glossing over. I mean, Darth Vader is introduced in this film, and before the prequels were even a thought, anything like that. I mean, Star Wars gave us probably the most iconic villain of all time.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
two performers behind Darth Vader. David Prowse was wearing the suit on set, and he sort of gave Darth Vader this physicality of the height and just the menacing appearance beyond the suit, just the way he was imposing. And James Earl Jones, of course, provides the voice work for Darth Vader. And they really combine to create an interesting vision of a villain, especially in A New Hope, where we don't know who Anakin Skywalker really is. We don't know that Darth Vader is Anakin Skywalker. So he's just kind of there to be the black and white, like
bad guy.
The bad guy. So those two sort of individual performances work in kind of perfect harmony in a really impressive way.
Yeah, definitely. And there's so much world building in this film as well.
Oh my God.
I mean, it really, you believe that this is all happening a long, long time ago, right?
Yeah.
In a galaxy far, far away. And it's really cool, I think. And especially for us, because we kind of, obviously we weren't around in 1977. So for us to be able to grow up when we did and see it when we did and still be so enthralled at a young age, because I know I was, and it's just really great. John Williams' score, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it speaks to the quality of the movie. I mean, this, you can talk about... It's interesting because the things that have aged the worst in this movie are the add-ons, like in the re-releases. Everything, because it's all miniature work, it's all matte paintings, physical sets. This movie visually holds up in a really beautiful way. But then anything like that's computer generated that was added years later kind of looks dated now. So that's an interesting...
Dinosaurs that are running around Tatooine.
That look bad.
Look bad.
Jabba in this movie looks bad.
I forgot about that scene.
Yeah.
I forgot about that scene. I forgot that's an add-on.
And it's so interesting because, like, you watch this and then you go to Return of the Jedi when he's actually a puppet and physically built, and you're like, wow, look at how good that looks.
Yeah. And it's because they shot that scene, and I think they just had Jabba as a dude.
Yes,
Jabba was just a dude.
Yeah, he was just wearing a fur vest.
And then they were like, oh, he's going to be this thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there was that line, because I just watched it last night, and Han says to Jabba, "You're a very pleasant human being." Is that the line? And it's like
cool, in two movies he's going to kidnap your girlfriend for like a sex life.
Yeah, he's a giant slug monster in a den. The Hutts.
Yeah. But I do want to actually go back to the world building, because I think what was probably the most Star Trek, right? Star Trek was probably the most famous sci-fi fantasy series that existed at the time, because I think Star Trek came out in the late 60s.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to George Lucas. I'm going to praise George Lucas for a second. But how confidently he wrote the world building in this, where you could throw away Tashi Station.
Yeah.
Or like, it's interesting because you don't really, I feel like, not to crap on current fantasy movies, but I feel like you really see a, like, confidence in throwing away things that exist in the world. And I think that's actually something, not to go too far ahead, but that the sequel movies do really well, is like they can throw out the concept of like, oh, Kylo Ren is the leader of the Knights of Ren, and then not mention the Knights of Ren for 2 more movies, and you're just like confident in the fact that exists somewhere in the world. I think it's something that Star Wars has done really well for a really long time. Yeah,
and it's sort of like as with A New Hope as a new movie, it's kind of like an impossible task to have people buy into this world. And sort of just like give that credence to you in a way where they're like, oh yeah, this works, and like you said, it's credit to Lucas for how confidently he wrote these movies.
Yeah, I mean, and getting back to just how well it holds up, especially for having come out in 1977, and yeah, despite the digital re-releases and add-ins, things like that, but I mean, just the dogfights in space, the Millennium Falcon, all of those things are just, they're so well done at the time, and I think that's the reason they hold up today.
Oh yeah.
You know,
I'd argue that the cinematography too in a lot of the scenes, like obviously there wasn't the cameras that exist now that shoot movies, but this was obviously probably shot on film. And like you look at that first scene of Luke and Tatooine looking at the binary and it's just like, yeah. Like,
Yeah.
that could hold up. That's the one perfect shot, Twitter.
Right,
It's like
right.
that shot. It's like that still holds up, and it's 50 years old. Like,
Yeah, I mean, like a century-defining shot,
yes.
like in cinema.
Yeah.
And I think that Star Wars, as it was being conceptualized and sort of released, was kind of like looked down upon, and you know, like it's just a sci-fi movie for kids. But the impact it had on cinema in general, it cannot possibly be understated. And I think that that's why Star Wars kind of gets a lot more respect now, just as movies, especially the original trilogy, for the influence they had on just movies in general.
Yeah, because I mean, especially when it came out, it was such a gamble too. I mean, there was a ton of
Oh my
money
God.
spent on the movie. The release was delayed a couple times. There were not too many people that had faith in it. I mean, Steven Spielberg vouched, but that was in a room full of naysayers.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's just really incredible that when it came out, it really did garner the support that it did financially. I mean, from the box office. And then, of course, a whole fan base was born out of this one movie,
Oh, yeah.
you know? And I think that's a really beautiful thing. We talk about iconic shots like the Twin Suns, but there's also, I mean, that shot, I have a sunshade for my car of the Millennium Falcon shot when they're first seeing the Death Star.
Oh, yeah.
I know, that's no moon.
Well, you think of, like, I want to talk about tone in a second, but the opening shot of this movie after the crawl is just that ship coming out of the darkness, and you're just like,
Yeah.
unheard of. And even today, that shot is terrifying. Just like the immensity of that ship coming through the stars like that. It's yeah. This movie.
Yeah. I mean, like we touched on, it's a miracle any movie gets made. But when you really like peel back a layer and go behind the scenes, like this movie should have been scrapped, probably shouldn't have been greenlit.
No.
And it turns out that it's one of the most impactful movies of all time. So
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and getting more back into some of these character dynamics, we talked a lot about in the prequel retrospectives how some of those lightsaber fights don't really hold up because they don't hold any weight. And then you look at
right.
Vader and Ben in this film, and the choreography is laughable.
yeah,
But that fight, you still feel the stakes in it,
Oh yeah.
and there's still so much mystery behind that relationship, which, like you kind of alluded to, Sam, is that it had room to grow as we knew other films were coming. And I think that's just the coolest thing.
Yeah, and bouncing off of that, I think it's interesting that Star Wars really gets this kind of like it's for kids, and it is like it was created for kids, but you think about the trust that George Lucas had in the kids he assumed would be watching this, because like there are people Empire was a sudden dark turn, and New Hope is really dark.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
a
Yes.
lot of
Oh,
like
yeah.
Leia is kidnapped and held captive. Luke's aunt and uncle are killed in front of him. Obi-Wan Kenobi is killed in front of him. There's this weird like tension between like Obi-Wan and Darth, and it's very adult.
Yeah.
Like it's very adult. And I think that not a lot of movies like that now place that kind of trust in that they'll be understood by kids
Right.
nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that like artists' perception of children and kind of like what is a kid's movie. And I think that some people tend to believe that kids' movies are movies that can only be enjoyed by kids. But in actuality, it's movies made with kids in mind. And I think that a lot of like bureaucrats behind the scenes sort of think like, oh, well, kids aren't going to get this. And George Lucas was like, no, I can make my Vietnam War allegory and I can make the Empire the Third Reich, and kids are still going to buy into this. Like trusting that children know more than you give them credit for. And I think that that's something that's really important in just art in general, intended for children. To sort of know, like, you don't need to dumb down anything.
Yeah.
Like, kids aren't dumb.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the darkness of the movie. We totally did mention that Leia watches her planet decimated in front of her.
Oh, yeah, that does happen.
That, to me, that was the shock.
Dark.
Yeah, it still gets me every time I see it. When Tarkin turns around and goes, all right, yeah, blow it up. I'm
Yeah.
like,
And she's like, what?
Yeah,
It's crushing.
Yeah, because he leads in saying that Dantooine is being targeted, and then he's just like, old switcheroo,
Yep.
got him, foul stench.
Yep.
Smelled it as soon as I came on board. Side note: there's a great documentary called Empire of Dreams about the making of the original trilogy, and not that Alderaan being exploded needs levity added to it, but if you watch that scene as it's originally filmed, they have to add the visual effects in later. So it's just Peter Cushing and Carrie Fisher giving it their all, and then just somebody on set just goes, bang, as soon as Alderaan comes up. And I laughed for like 5 minutes watching that documentary. It's so funny because it's this huge scene, and what it means for Star Wars, for who the Empire is, for Leia and how she operates in the future is just massive, and it's all done by a guy saying bang on screen.
Man.
Yeah, you have to wonder how many other times on set that had to happen.
A lot.
Right? Things like that.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
But there's so much great behind the scenes stuff about this movie. Like revisiting it will just warm your heart so much. Like there's with when they're on the Death Star and Peter Mayhew is delivering his lines in English. So he's talking to Han, and instead of having the Wookiee roar, he just goes, "That old man's mad." And it's so, if you love Star Wars, like revisiting this stuff is so cool because like we've been talking about, this movie shouldn't exist.
Wow.
And it does, and the world's all the better for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Star Wars New Hope is really great. So.
Oh, we have to talk about the editing.
Oh yeah, let's
The
get
editing.
yeah, definitely.
So there was apparently a lot of footage from this movie, and it went through quite a few different phases of post-production hell. And what the rumor is, but it's kind of factual if you watch the movie, is that Marcia Lucas, George Lucas's wife, edited this movie, and I believe she was nominated for an Oscar for it.
She won, I believe.
I think she did.
Yeah.
And it saved the movie. You think about how this movie doesn't really let you breathe with how well it's edited, with how quick the story moves. It trusts that you will understand. There's no weird, long, awkward 5 seconds of silence at the end of scenes. I'm looking at you. God, Revenge of the Sith and Attack of the Clones. But yeah, the editing in this movie is fantastic. Even the star wipes.
Yeah.
They still do it in the sequel trilogy, but it works. And
Yeah.
you don't know why it works, but it works. And it's edited to the bone, and it's so good.
Yeah, and it's just going into this concept that we sort of touched on with the prequels, where you can't create something like this by yourself. And all the credit in the world to George Lucas. He's a crazy madman genius that pulled off a miracle. But movies are inherently a collaborative process, and if you only have one voice and one vision going into it, it's probably not going to work.
And a bunch of yes man.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
having Marcia sort of swoop in and edit this movie, and film editors in general really don't get their praises sung enough, because bad editing can ruin a movie, no matter how good a script is or the direction is or the performances are. If a movie's edited poorly, it's over.
Yeah.
So, just not even talking about the fact that this was George Lucas's wife, and women behind the scenes of these movies do not get referenced at all. For somebody to come in and have that big an impact on what this movie is huge and should be talked about more.
Yeah, speaking of women behind the scenes, how long did it take for the public to find out that Carrie Fisher was a script doctor on
yeah.
all of these films? It's...
I mean, as big a contribution to film as she made as her performances.
Absolutely.
She was brilliant behind the scenes, because Carrie, a hallmark of who she was her wit and her intelligence. And so, yeah, being able to punch up the script and, little things like that. We want to talk about George Lucas and the vision, and some people tend to be mad now that he's not involved, but it's look a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
Peel just a couple layers behind, and you'll see that this was much more of a team effort than than you want to give it credit for. And again, no disrespect to George Lucas at all, but that's just the way it goes when you're trying to make good art like this.
Absolutely. I think that goes for any good art too. It needs to be a team effort. That's what films are. They're collaborative, right? Yeah. So just some final thoughts on episode 4, A New Hope. I think this movie's great. I think we all agree on that.
Yeah.
And I think the groundwork that it lays for this universe and for this franchise is just amazing and mind-blowing that it worked when it did and how it did. And we still have it today. And we're still entertained by Star Wars stories even today. And I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah, I absolutely adore A New Hope. It's like, we want to talk about Empire being better because it expanded on it and everything, and we'll get into Empire in the next Star Wars retrospective. But Star Wars A New Hope is a perfect movie.
I agree.
It's a perfect movie, and I think that some people have like perceptions like maybe it's a little slow, but I think that it's without a peer in everything it is accomplished and done and led to. So just like have to be thankful that this movie exists.
Oh yeah. I love this movie. I think this might be tentatively my favorite Star Wars movie. If I were to be like, I want to watch a Star Wars movie today, it's going to be A New Hope. I just think it's even if there wasn't, because now you can't go into the world without understanding that there's multiple Star Wars movies. If you only knew that like you could watch one Star Wars movie as a contained story, it's A New Hope.
Yes.
It's like you said, it's a perfect movie. I think the score is flawless. The editing is flawless. The writing, I'll give George Lucas this, it's flawless. Campy but flawless.
Yeah.
And I still boggle sometimes watching it, being like, they had no idea that more of this was to come, and you can end on that medal ceremony. Like, you do not need Darth Vader flies off into space, and you're just like, that's the end of the movie.
Yeah.
That's their self-contained Star Wars story, and I think it's a masterpiece.
Yeah, absolutely. So that wraps up our 4th Star Wars retrospective on A New Hope. Looking forward to episode 5, Empire Strikes Back. Once again, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. You can find us on Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you get your podcasts. I'm Gianni.
I'm Flynn.
I'm Sam.
Thanks again.